On, yes, I believe. Okay.
Oh, there is no allow. My number is, here we are. Okay.
We're so excited and honored to be doing this with Isabel. And it's in mentioning at the very beginning, the Northwest African American Museum. It was just 10 years ago, next month, that for the book that was about as old as Caste, their new book, is in the world. It was about 4 days in the world, The Warmth of Other Suns. She came to the Northwest African American Museum, and it was a third stop on the West Coast, and the others have gone well, but the Seattle and the museum were the first place she was greeted with real fervor and anticipation and hunger for what the story she told in that book, that's been a classic since it's been in a reader's hand, of the migration of Black people from the South to the North, and to the West Coast, and the central part of the US and the eastern part. And it's a story so many people here have lived, and of course I'm talking to people who are part of this program who are everywhere. So it's really a huge and vast human story that she wrote. And if that had been the only thing she'd written, that would have been her a tremendous lasting contribution to our literature and our culture. And not only has she written a new book, it hasn't been 15 years for the next one. And yet seeing the title alone, realized she was working again on something quite astonishing. And that's come to pass with this book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. And it's a book, I won't say too much about it because that's what this program is, but she again takes some notions that are out there. And actually the word caste was used more probably in the 19th century in certain writings about race, what we're calling race most of the time here. But she traces its uses in all sorts of ways, and then also gives it some other context by linking the story of caste in this country to the country it's probably most thought of when you use the word caste, and that being India. But also a little portion on what happened in Nazi Germany. So laced through these are historical studies, drawing on other books, other scholars, her own travels, experiences of both historic figures, but common people in the same kind of approach that she brought to The Warmth of Other Suns. And she does so, the part I really will say is with a writing narrative that is restrained, is quietly elegant, and I would say it's subtle, except she's also saying these bold and remarkable things. You're kind of like having these oh my goodness moments. What did I just read? But it's writing that doesn't draw attention to itself, so it may not get commented on that way, because the stories where she's pointing, what she's drawing attention to, is quite significant, and she doesn't try and draw it to herself, except in this book, as in the other, every once in a while these personal moments are dropped in, and that also brings the book home to an individual stake, a human stake in all these stories. So the way this program will work is at some point Wes Moore will join us. Let me say a little bit about Wes, because when he does join us, it'll probably be like, here I am and here you are, and we won't get to say anything much about him. He was added to this just a few days ago, all the moving parts that go on with things in the world right now. But he himself, we hope to do a program with, because he has his own new book and a series of books he's done. In fact, he also has spoken at the Northwest African American Museum. But this new book is called 5 Days, The Fiery Reckoning of an American City, which he, with journalist Erica Green, who was then of the Baltimore Sun, but is now at the New York Times, a newspaper that Isabel worked with for many years. It's a story of what happened in Baltimore in 2015 with the killing of Freddie Green, and what happened with the Baltimore Police Department, and then what happened in Baltimore. And it was a kind of harbinger for where we are this year. And it's both, this year did not just, what's happened since the killing of George Floyd is not something to just, kindled something new, but it's what Wes Moore wrote about that book is part of a lineage of these kinds of incidents and what's happened in cities of response. I will say that's part circling back to Isabel. There's nothing of the moment like that with this book, except the book has been born to this moment, and the kind of writing and that's also been part of what's gone on, is that people have been turning and reading deeply and historically as well as to the current. So that Isabel's book managed to link both the current and the past. So if I didn't finish saying, you can ask questions by the little Q&A tab on the bottom. And hopefully Wes will be the one to pose those after he's had words with Isabel after she's talked, and they have a back and forth. I will be here until Wes shows up, though, and they won't leave Isabel alone. And then following all that, we will. I'll probably come back at the end. I know many of you, by coming tonight this way, have already purchased the book of Isabel's book. And I didn't even hold that up. And there's many other things. It's Oprah Winfrey has already got this going, and I won't digress too much. But if you ever want to hear Oprah really do something literary, hear her at the Toni Morrison Memorial. I don't know if Isabel saw that, but it's a whole thing of reading from Song of Solomon. But anyway, Oprah's all over this book, as are many other early readers, and books, her book, Wes's book, and some of the others will get mentioned are available at elliottbaybook.com. If you, in fact, they're signed. We have a limited number of signed copies. I mean, everyone who bought one through the ticket approach will get one, but we have a limited number of other signed copies. So this is already one of those books you'll want to give to others. I can assure you, but I'll let Isabel say your words, and you'll, I think, be more convinced of that. So. Again, knowing that Wes will join us, because he was actually in this, somewhere on the periphery of these things, he's getting admitted. Now's the part where if Isabel would be, you wouldn't even be seeing her if we were in a hall, and she'd be behind the door, and I would be saying these last words like thanking you again for coming, which I do, and asking you to please join her in welcoming her. And there would be this thunderous applause, because that she now has that coming at her. So I know you can't, your applause can't be heard, but I know your good energy and your good attention is aimed at your screens. And in that way, please now welcome the most remarkable and wonderful Isabel Wilkerson.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here, only virtually. I love Seattle. I've had so many wonderful experiences with Elliott Bay Books. I'm so thrilled to be here talking about this new book.
Good. And it is, again, just a few days into the world with the book.
Yeah.
Say a little bit about when did you finish the book? Because I mean, this year, everything's so strange. We were talking beforehand about everything. I mean, I don't want to make this whole thing about getting the book out, but there is the part where there's a usual way you write a book and the usual way you get it published. And for us to know about the books, it's been all different. But so we're all in this moment together that way. Say a little about when this book came to an end for you, because I remember with Warmth of Other Suns, you really were working on that to the last minute.
Yeah.
The text and the writing of it.
Yeah, well, of course, with The Warmth of the Suns, I spent 15 years on that book to tell the story, as you mentioned, of 6 million African Americans who migrated out of the Jim Crow South to all points north, Midwest, and West. And it was in the process, actually, after that book came out, that it sort of one thing just led to another for this current book. This current book grew out of The Warmth of the Suns, because when I was working on that book and trying to recreate the world of the people who had been forced on some level to flee Jim Crow, the Jim Crow regime, I was searching around for the word to describe what they had experienced. And in the process of doing that, I found that I was not using the word racism, a word that does have meaning and has been used in the past and is used today. But I found that word was not sufficient to describe the organized, interlocking rules and laws, customs and expectations, and in fact, the restrictions that were placed upon people in essentially a hierarchy that they had been born into, and that they had escaped, in some ways sought you might say, sought refuge in the rest of the country. And so I ended up using not the word racism, though it's associated with that, and many other people use the word racism to describe what I wrote in Warmth of the Suns, but instead I used the word caste. I used the word caste system. And it turned out that readers were able to follow that. Readers were able to really fall into the flow of the narrative. It made sense in the context of what I was writing. And so this current book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, grows out of that. It's a deeper exploration of the phenomenon that I first began referring to in The Warmth of Other Suns. And I wanted to really unpack it. I wanted to look at it from various angles to give us, in some ways, access to new language, a new framework for understanding ourselves, how we interact with one another, and more importantly, what we have inherited. You know, no one alive today is responsible for the framework and the infrastructure of the hierarchies that we have inherited. This dates all the way back to colonial times, before there was the United States of America. And so this is a way of understanding all that preceded us. The subtitle is significant because it's saying the origins of our discontents. It's the history of how we came to have the hierarchies that have been passed down through the generations. What caste essentially is an artificial hierarchy in which there's a graded ranking of human beings that indicates a value applied to people based upon where they're born into the hierarchy. And this human value is related to, it determines one's standing, one's level of respect accorded to them, benefit of the doubt, the kinds of things that you have really nothing to do with. It's just you show up and this is what you carry, based upon what the society assumes about you on the basis of this measure. And so I wanted to really look deeply into this because I feel that by understanding our divisions and how we got to where we are, meaning or understanding the origins of all these things, perhaps it will lead us toward a greater understanding of how to push through them and to transcend them.
So when you were coming up with that notion of looking for this other term, how much of that was, did you feel, I mean, your frame of reference, I mean, you've been a serious journalist, you wrote this, and I will say this about The Warmth of Other Suns, which is a book that is framed entirely within the context. Oh, good, we'll get to Wes's here in just a moment, yay. But now I've got a question. Forget what it was. But the part where I was gonna say, The Warmth of Other Suns, it's actually taught as a form of migration or even refugee studies in other countries. Yes. The colleague who taught with you, I think at Emory, Layla Kalavi, I think is her name, an Iranian-born fiction writer who spoke highly of you as a colleague, but she said she had used this to teach about the Iranian diaspora, and some of which has been in refugee, but also other form of moving. So, so I was going to say, how much of it was you looking outside the U.S. to think of this, and how much it was because it was 19th century, the word caste was used quite a bit.
Well, that is such a great question because in trying to unpack and understand caste, I naturally needed to look to where did that word come from, looking clearly to the originating caste system, the one that comes most readily to mind, the most readily, instantly recognizable caste system in the world, which would be the one in India. So of course, that was one of the first places that I went to look to better understand how does the caste work there? How did that form? What are the gradations and what is the structure of the caste system, the original one? And to see where are the parallels, where are the divergences, where is it that this word applies and the concept can apply to us, and where might it not? So that was one of the places that I looked. So I was purposely looking outside the borders of our own country to find out how other countries had dealt with hierarchy and how we were in some ways paralleling it in ways that we didn't even know. I mean, one of the things that I describe about it is that caste is I describe our country as like an old house. An old house, if you live in an old house, you know that the work is never done. There's always something yet to be done. There's always, as soon as you fix one thing, there's something else that has to be attended to. And so if you think of our country as an old house, then you think about the structure of it. And so caste in some ways is the invisible framework that we all know is there, that supports the society that we live in, but that we often don't see. It's invisible. We know that it's there, and we rely upon it on some level, and yet we don't see it. So caste is the bones, and race is the skin, is how I describe it. And race, the difference between caste and race is that race is the tool, it's the signifier, it's the signal, it's the cue as to where a person fits or is assigned, one would say, in the caste system. And when I say assigned, I mean going back from the original founding of the country, which was founded, as we all know, by British colonists, who were by definition going to be at the top of the hierarchy of the country that they were building, and then bringing in African enslaved people to be enslaved from Africa, which then became the automatic bottom of the hierarchy. And then others, as they arrive, fitting inside that hierarchy, or trying to find ways to navigate within that hierarchy. And so that's the framework that we live with. That is what we inherited. And that now it's a question, in some ways, of trying to better understand it and see how it affects us.
Great. Now I think is the appropriate moment for me to step away, as much to Isabel's relief and certainly to mine, and having Wes Moore join us. And Wes, two things. Well, we have to do this for you too, because you came into place just this week, but in this program, but you have your own excellent new book, and we talked about that a little bit as I was introducing Isabel, the whole program, and I'll pull it up again, the book 5 days, The Fury Reckoning of an American City. So we'll address that otherwise to see if we can do this with you. But we just got started, and you've missed some good Isabel. You haven't missed any good questions. And so I'll disappear.
I'm just enjoying the conversation.
Yeah, well, I will say, Isabel, to this, because it probably won't come up in any other context, when you write about the leaky basement, which you do a few times in this book, that little house I'm in has a leaky basement. I felt the basement kind of gurgled up, said, oh boy, somebody's writing about a leaky basement. They don't get written about every day. So there was a little bit going on. So Wes, I'll disappear and let you take over, and you two will be fine. I don't know if you've even ever met, not that you're getting to meet here, but you have your virtual introduction. And I'll reappear at the very end to help wrap this up. And thank you both. But thank you so much for getting here, Wes. We knew we heard you were hanging around outside.
Okay. We were watching the interview and enjoying it. And I just start. So first, thank you so much, Rick, and Isabel. This is an absolute honor.
Okay. So I'll disappear now after you get. Well, I'll listen. I'll keep listening, but I'll be back. Thank you.
Thank you.
This really is an honor. I have been a huge fan and admirer from the Warmth of Other Suns, and then this was a book that from the first moment, from the first pages, it just grabs you, and it will not let you go. And it's one of these things that it challenges assumptions, and it forces you to think to yourself, how have we not understand so much of this stuff before, right? And so first, not just congratulations, but truly thank you for a book that is going to make us better. And so the first thing I actually want to follow up on a question that Rick was asking before, because I think there's a brilliant analogy where you do talk about this idea of caste being the bones and race being the skin. And I'm interested in that in terms of how you thought about the selection of the different areas that you wanted to follow, where you ended up doing the deep dive into places like Germany and the deep dive into places like India. Can you talk about, even though you touch on other places, can you touch on why you went into a deep dive into those areas? And then, because the question I then have is, when you think about the history of the United States, for example, where the German example, where you still had a casting system of Germans, right, where of different religious belief, but Germans. Same thing with India. In the United States, it's really more a conversation of people versus property. And can you talk about how you went through that process of analyzing caste and deciding where you wanted to, where you decided to land on where you wanted to follow?
Well, so first of all, it's fabulous to meet you even virtually. So just to see you is just amazing. So I'm so honored that you're here, that we're speaking in this era that we live in. So, writing about caste meant, or exploring caste meant that by definition, I was going to have to go to deal with India. I was going to have to, go to India. I was going to have to spend a lot of time understanding, reading about India, and reading about how caste worked there as a way of understanding the original the original hierarchy known as caste, and also even discovering where the word even came from, how that word was applied to it. But what happened was, in the process of beginning to do this work, Charlottesville happened, and Charlottesville then is what led me to look at Germany, because there before us at Charlottesville, you know, with the protesters who were there to keep the monument to Robert E. Lee from being taken down, there was the symbolism there before us, symbolism of the Confederacy, symbolism of the Nazis, and merging together, fusing with the protesters. So they are the ones that made this connection between the history of the United States and of Germany. And so that really inspired me and forced me to have to look at what has Germany done in the intervening decades after World War II, to reconcile with that history, to atone for that history. How do they educate one another? How do they remember? Because a lot of this has to do with memory of the Civil War, memory of American history overall, memory of enslavement. How are they remembering what happened there, and how is it that people can even make the connection in Charlottesville to begin with? Then the deeper that I got into it, I then began to discover or be exposed to things that I never, ever would have imagined. I mean, one of them has me having to do with the fact that German eugenicists were in constant dialogue with American eugenicists in the years and decades leading up to the Third Reich. I had no idea that.
That was fascinating.
Just fascinating. American eugenicists, the books that they wrote were huge sellers in Germany in the years leading up to the Third Reich. And of course, the Germans needed no one to teach them how to hate. They had that within them, no question whatsoever. They needed no one to teach them how to hate. But it turned out that they actually sent researchers to the United States to study how America had subjugated it's what I would call subordinated castes of African Americans, to study how America had subordinated and repressed and segregated African Americans. They actually sent people to study America, to see how America had done this. And then they studied the laws and then went back and debated those laws, debated Jim Crow laws and other miscegenation laws in the United States as they were forming their own laws that would become known as the Nuremberg laws. So these things were just were wrenching and just shocking to discover. And that's how I ended up writing about these two other hierarchies as we were looking into our own.
And it's interesting too, because you watch how this idea of not even just racial segregation or caste and segregation, but then also you watched how there was this idea, take South Africa, for example, there was the racial segregation of the racial segregation, right? The invention of this idea of colors, for example, right? How did that factor into the thinking and the things that you saw when it came to the creation of caste, and how those elements were used to continue to fortify this casting system?
That is such a great question. I mean, that is really the central question. The thing about it is each of these hierarchies, each of these caste systems would come up with different metrics to delineate who could be in which caste, who could be on top and who was at the bottom. So it's arbitrary. It's random. It really, I mean, it's arbitrary. It could have been height. It could have been the color of one's eyes. And in other places, it's religion. It's whatever is delineated that can divide and then rank people. And here in this country, even before there was the United States, there was this ranking that was based upon what people look like, skin color, the origins of where they had come from, the lineage as manifested in their phenotype. And that was then used here. And then it's been, and it's a relatively new concept. I mean, we think of race as being primordial, as being just part of the, the order of the universe or something. But actually, it's a fairly new concept that actually grew out of the transatlantic slave trade, and preceding that, the exploration of Europeans as they went around the world and discovered people who looked different from themselves. But more importantly, the transatlantic slave trade that then brought together people from different parts of the world who, because they were from different parts of the world, happened to look different from one another, and then used that as the measure of how people would be categorized. This categorization was random. It's much more random than we would otherwise think. We now come to accept it as the law of nature, but these are not natural. These are man-made divisions that were decided, and then so that race then becomes the signifier of where a person fits in the hierarchy.
And you make a really powerful and important argument for this idea of a truth process, of a truth and reconciliation. And we look at how other countries have gone through similar type of processes, whether it is Burundi or Rwanda or Northern Ireland or Colombia or Chile or Canada twice or South Africa. Should the United States look at this idea of a truth and reconciliation process? And if so, especially considering the creation of this idea of class, and to your point, how the idea of whiteness and the idea of race was a creation, was a creation really to fortify a system of class. Yeah. What is the process that the United States should actually think through and consider if we were to decide this is something that we have to dig into?
Well, now I have to preface this by saying that when I wrote this book, I am presenting myself as like the structural building inspector for the building. So I come in, I take all of these tools of research, and I shine a light, infrared light or whatever you want to call it, into the corners that may not have been seen and examined, and then I come back to you with a report about this is the state of the building. This is this. And so when you do that, if you've ever had an old house or you bought a house and the building inspector comes in and then they give you a report about all the systems, plumbing, electrical, structural, and all that. And then it's up to you as the owner of the house to then look at that list and say, this is what needs to be done. And so I am presenting this to all of us, and all of us are the collective owners of this building. And then it falls to all of us because it will take all of us.
That's right.
It will take us.
That's right.
To find a way to transcend an inheritance that is 400 years old. It will take all of us. And so for that, I say that to say that I do not present or even deign to present all of the answers. My job is to present this framework for understanding, to illuminate what has gone unseen for too long, and in hopes that it will spark the imaginations of the desire to even know more, to read more, to study more, to know more about the history, so that we can then find a way to heal. That said, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is the bare minimum of what we should be experiencing as we try to better understand what's gone before us, understand our history. When I wrote the Warmth of the Suns, I went out to talk about it, as we all do, as I know you did, and you hear from the public and you hear all kinds of things. And I don't know the many, many amazing things that you've heard for your books. For me, one of the things that I hear most often with the first book was, I had no idea. I hear that all the time. I had no idea about the history. Yeah. These are people who actually lived through the era. I mean, people who lived through this era will say, I had no idea. So that means that there is still not enough known about our history. There's still a long way to go to understand our history. So I believe that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission effort is part of the process of coming to a reckoning, to first understand, for all of us to get on the same page about what actually happened in our country. And without the often freighted emotions that can come from certain language that we're accustomed to hearing, that evoke a sense of shame and guilt and blame, and we have to push past those emotions. That's the reason why Caste is such, to me, in some ways, a liberating way of looking at it, because it's about the structure. It's about the fact of the structure. It's not about feelings. It's not about emotions. It's not about liking this person and not liking this person. It's about the structure that we've inherited. And so, an effort to try to get on the same page about what has even happened in our country. Most people don't know that enslavement went on for 246 years, that it went on for so long that no adult alive today will be alive at the point at which African Americans will have been free for as long as they had been enslaved. I mean, that's a stunning thing to think about. And that, that it wasn't until the 1960s that African Americans, because of the civil rights legislation of 1964, 65, and 68, that it's still a fairly new proposition, a fairly new experience for African Americans to actually have the chance, the opportunities to do such things as to be able to vote, to be able to apply for jobs that before were forbidden to them. So this is we're very new. This is not ancient history. This is fairly new, this idea of opening up into the mainstream of the people who've been consigned to the bottom for so long. So I say all that to say that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is part of what I would think would be necessary to educate all of us on the true history of our country so we can understand how we got to where we are.
And one of the things that as far as I completely agree with you, because you're right that part of the thing we're dealing with is we're not even all dealing with the same facts about history, about how we got there. And to your point, that we're dealing with something that is very unemotional. Right. That when we talk about racism, or we talk about this idea of race or the introduction of race into conversations, oftentimes people think that racism comes down to an act. Yes. Right? It's individual doing X, or if an individual says something, they are racist, or does something, they are racist, without understanding that this is actually a system that has then been baked in, and how it's something that's been baked in for a very, very, long period of time. And when we're talking about this deconstruction of caste, and when we're looking at societies that have actually tried to understand caste as the mechanism and caste as the very unemotional infrastructure that so many of these elements of inequality and inequity are built upon, how then, and how have you thought about countries and places and geographies that have really tried to break that down and try to understand, okay, if we are dealing with the level of class, how do we deal with it, versus if we're thinking about this as a level of racism or a level of something else that we then have to go through the process of the deconstruction process?
Well, I'm glad you brought up class, because that is a concept that you might say three-legged stool of inequality, and race being one. Caste, of course, is what I'm introducing here, and of course, caste is. I'm not the first to mention caste as a factor. There's actually a long tradition. I wanted to make sure I said there's a long tradition, generally within the academy, of applying the term caste, the phenomenon of caste, to better understand our society, going back to the anthropologists of the 1930s who emerged from their research of Jim Crow South, using that term. So there's a tradition of using this term. It just has not become mainstreamed as it might otherwise have been. But in terms of class, so I've talked about caste, and I've talked about race. I talk about caste as the bones and race as the skin. Well, class would then be the clothing and the diction and the voice and the accent and education and all the other things that we can do to improve oneself, or to move up, or to present ourselves as we wish to be seen, and to improve ourselves, or to even lose if somehow we don't do those things. So class, I often say that that if you can act your way out of it, it's class. If you cannot act your way out of it, it's caste. And to that point, I often think about the actor.
Oh, wow. Can you say that again? I like that. I like that. I like that.
Yeah, if you can act your way out of it, it's class. If you cannot act your way out of it, it's caste. And one example that comes to mind is the experience of Forrest Whitaker, that esteemed, one of the most esteemed actors of our time, who has an Academy Award, and and Oscar, one of the most incredible actors of our time. And he walked into an upscale deli in Manhattan a few years ago, and he went in to see if they had what he wanted. They didn't. He turned to walk out, and the staff actually stopped him, blocked him at the door, and then searched him there in front of all the other customers. Here he is, an Academy Award winner, Academy Award winning actor, who's being searched, on the ground, searched as a common criminal because of what he looks like, meaning because of the signals that sent to the unconscious signals about what a person who looks like him must be up to if they come into a store and then don't buy anything. And that's one where he has done everything that a person can do to be successful in society. He actually would be considered, upper class. I mean, he's as successful as you possibly could be. Yeah. And yet in an instant, he and others like him, I mean, any of us who fall in that category, could be reminded in an instant of which caste we are perceived to be in. And that's what I mean by the difference between class and caste.
And it's and also how there's this really wonderful way of also showing how the caste that you perceive yourself to be in is also this massive determining factor as to what you think other caste and where you think other people in the human race, what they deserve versus what they don't deserve, based on a perception, right? Who is worthy, who is not, who has earned it, who has not. And there's this part where you spoke about this one gentleman who was who said that he'd rather die than support Obamacare, and then sadly he did actually pass away from a lack of health care. This idea of earning, this idea of what a person deserves, and where you also mentioned this idea that there's a fact that people will almost even vote against their interests and vote against the things that would better benefit them because of a sense of not wanting to grant some form of unearned privilege. How does that then play into this caste conversation?
Well, I mean, I describe, caste as being, a kind of graded ranking that confers deservedness, worthiness, a perception of worthiness on the basis of the received messaging through the generations that all of us have been exposed to. And so that the idea that one group of the dominant group are presented as more worthy, that the stereotypes, the negative stereotypes that attach to people who are, further down in the hierarchy, assigned below them in the hierarchy, all the stereotypes that are so commonly known that attach to people end up creating these inequalities in how people are seen just from the start. For example, the idea that the famous Princeton study that found that African American that employers at Princeton, that employers are more willing to hire a white felon than they are a black person with no criminal record. And that is the way that these assumptions of worthiness and deservedness also come in. Comfort level, of course, but a willingness to take a chance on someone. I mean, if it's actually just fear, then it would be, you would not want to have a felon of any background there. But you're willing to take a chance on someone who is viewed as the more deserving, worthy, dominant caste, even if they have a felony record, as opposed to someone from the historically subordinated caste who has no record. And that's how you can see that there's a value attached to being in the dominant group. And the goal of all of this would be to not to demote anyone, but to lift everyone up, to bring out the best potential of everyone. Because one of the most tragic consequences of a caste system is that we lose the potential of so many members of our species. We lose if you think about those cotton fields and those rice plantations and those sugar plantations and those tobacco fields during the time of enslavement, on those tobacco fields and rice plantations and sugar plantations and tobacco fields, there were jazz musicians and opera singers and attorneys and engineers and journalists, all kinds of people. And they never, for 246 years of enslavement, followed by 80 or 90 years of Jim Crow segregation and caste system in that way, you have millions upon millions of people just in this country alone, not to mention other countries around the world, that have these kind of disparities, people who were never allowed to reach their full potential. And it occurs even to this day because we still have we live in the shadow of this caste system going back to that time. And so we are the greatest loss would be the potential of human beings who could be here. We are facing so many crises as a species. As a planet, we're facing so many crises. We can't afford to be losing the potential of people in our species who could be helping. We need everybody on deck to be able to do this. And these kind of graded inequalities, the graded rankings that hurt people in so many ways. There are health consequences to this. People who suffer as a result, people who are targets of these assumptions of trying to put people in their place, which is what a caste system does. It puts people in their place. When we see these videos of people who are going about their business, African Americans just sitting at a Starbucks waiting for a friend, trying to, having a barbecue at a park, trying to get into one's own condo building, and then someone comes in, calls the police on them, blocks their path, assumes that they don't belong. That is the hallmark of caste. Caste in the Jim Crow sense was everyone was to remain in their place. It's about boundaries and staying in your role. Your role is either dominant or subordinate, what you've inherited. And so when we're in a world in which people are when anyone is restricted, even those at the top who may be restricted because they may be expected to do a certain thing or act in a particular way that they may not even want to do, that means that you are limiting the potential of every single human being as long as you have these restrictions on people. And so everyone ends up losing as a result of that. Everyone.
And when you, and along those lines, when you mentioned before, which actually I did not know, about the importance of Charlottesville, and how Charlottesville really helped to shape the, not just the frame of the book, but the takeaways and what you wanted to build together. You also wrote this before George Floyd, before Ahmaud Arbery, before Breonna Taylor, before this movement that we're seeing right now. If there was, and if there were things, are there things that this movement you think also helped to reflect or shape, or is there anything that you've seen right now that you think challenges some of the assumptions or the things that were baked out? And when you think about the movement that we are seeing right now, are you hopeful that the conversation is actually going to tap into these core crucial issues? So when people talk about, this original sin of the United States, the reality is the original sin actually came long before the United States was even an idea. So how do you feel about this current place and whether or not that's helped shift or shape it all? And what are you seeing about the current movement that then makes you think about how all these other elements that you speak about in Caste will get reflected into the goal?
You're absolutely right that there is no way I would have ever anticipated what is happening right now. This book was not written for a particular moment. This is a work of history, that puts in context where we happen to be in general. But I could not have imagined that we would be in the midst of a global pandemic, and then the things that have occurred in this ensuing months that we have observed. The tragedies, the heartbreak, the unimaginable things that we have seen. I actually have been heartened by the response, though, from people who may not have had to have thought about this in the way that marginalized people who live with this every day. I've been heartened by there were protests that occurred in all 50 states. I mean, there were protests that occurred in South Dakota. There were protests that occurred in Idaho. There were protests that occurred in Rhode Island and all over the country. I mean, there were protests all over. And the only way past this is for every human being, all of us, to recognize that we have a stake in each other's well-being, a stake in each other's prosperity, an idea that we are all in this together. We're on this planet all together, and we all should feel that we have a stake in one another. But I feel that we could, in theory, could possibly be on the cusp of an awakening. When you see what happened in the UK, for example, with the mass protest that took down one of the statues in Bristol in UK, one of the statues of one of the enslavers, one of the people who actually brought people from Africa in the transatlantic slave trade. That statue coming down, and the sense that there were all kinds of people who were part of that, and there was a sense of finally reckoning with the history, finally seeing the damage that had been done, not just to African Americans, but you might say to the soul of everyone who now has to live with this. And so I do find that this is could be a time of hope. It depends upon what we want to do with it. It depends on what all of us collectively choose to do with this.
You did a wonderful job of kind of weaving in when we say the idea of what is it that we all want to do with it. But that it also means that we have to understand the infrastructure that was built up and understand a relative measure of complicity that we all then own in terms of and discomfort that we all must have to understand if we're going to be honest about that and truly address it, instead of just continuing to work to calcify it generation after generation, which oftentimes we have done. How do we navigate that that narrative, that idea that for us to be able to, for us to say we all have to move forward, we all also then have to understand our own complicity in helping to build it up in the first place. And then thinking about it where, because oftentimes there's a level of tribalism that plays into so many of these conversations. How do we then think through this idea of navigating it without everyone retreating into the tribalism mentality, and where everything becomes binary, everything becomes, if, for this person to gain, then I must lose. But understanding that actually one of the beauties of being able to address caste is that doesn't necessarily have to be the case if we were to think about it in a different way.
Well, actually, I mean, there are studies that show that these things are hurting everyone's health. There are consequences to this level of division. There are consequences to the level of autonomic resistance to someone who looks different from you. That cortisone levels rise and inflammation rises. We get exposed. People can get exposed to stressors that can actually lead to higher rates of stroke and heart disease. There are consequences to harboring distrust and unconscious biases against others. I mean, this is making people sick, literally. And then when it comes for people who harbor, who may be in a more position of dominance, or born to a group of that is viewed as dominant historically, and then those who've been born to the group that has been historically subordinated suffer tremendous health consequences, in which there's such a thing as weathering, where actually the telomeres, the ends of the cells, actually begin to shorten because of the level of stress of navigating a world in which you may not be given the benefit of the doubt, where at any moment you could be someone could come in, or something could come in to try to put you in your place or to diminish you somehow. These things have consequences for all of us. And of course, all of these things, you want to make it economic, all of these things cost money to the economy in terms of productivity, in terms of people being able to make the most of the talent that we may have. There are all kinds of cures to the challenges that we have, and we were able to maybe make use of all of the potential that we actually have as a species. I often speak of species as opposed, now I've moved on to species because that's where we are right now. We need to think as a species, because we face so many problems and challenges as a species. And so that is where, that is one of the things. And then finally, though, I would say that, by looking at this without the emotion, and looking at it, I use so many metaphors in this book because I'm trying as best I can to build bridges to understanding, to try to reach people's hearts as well as their minds. And so one of them is the idea of when you go to the doctor or the office will give you, the nurse or someone will give you a clipboard, and on that clipboard you're supposed to fill out these forms. All these forms you fill out, and on those forms they're asking you about the ailments that you've had in the past and all the various things you've been through. But then they ask about your history, your family history. They may ask about your parents and what they had experienced, and they may even ask about your grandparents. In other words, the doctor won't even see you until you have filled out a form that gives the history, your family's history. And so if you think about it from the standpoint of a country becomes a family on some level, an extended family, whether we choose to be or not, but we ultimately are. And you make a discovery, you discover that there's something that runs in the family, whether it's alcoholism or it's heart disease or something like that. You discover that there's a problem that runs in the family, a medical problem. You don't start pointing fingers at people. You don't start feeling shame and blame as a result of that. You go and you do the research, you look and see what is it that this entails, how can I change the diet, should I exercise more? You look to figure out what do you do when you have this problem. And so if there's a problem, and it appears to be with the divisions and rupture that we are experiencing as a country, there's a problem. What do you do about that problem? Again, not the emotion, but rather sitting down and figure out what do you do when you realize that there's something that runs in the family. And that's sort of where we are. Something's running in the family, and it's time to address it.
And it's a really powerful argument for what you were saying earlier about the need for us to go through a process of really understanding truth, because it's very difficult to come up with with a cure to an ailment if you don't fully understand the ailment.
Exactly.
Right?
And that's the process that you're speaking about, that we still, and that's also the link that also seemed to be missing from so much of this.
Yes, it is.
One of the things that you'd mentioned earlier was that Caste in many ways was born from Warmth of Other Suns, right?
Yeah.
Where this was something that you knew from the writing of the first book that you then wanted to dig in and to explore into this second book. What were some of the unanswered questions from Caste that you might also now look into next as the next things that you want to be able to explore and dig into?
Well, now, you have written several books, so you know how to write a book. And then the book's only been out for 2 days. And then people start asking, so what's the next thing you're working on?
What are you doing with all your free time now, Isabel?
So that actually is a question I cannot answer. I'm still recovering from this out. Because of COVID-19, believe it or not, I don't even have a copy of the book myself. I don't. So I
did the same thing. I didn't get my book until after it was released. I ordered it.
I know. I think I'm about to go. So I might go on Elliott Bay Books right now after this is done and order.
There you go. Well, and I think, and so, one of the question though that I do have was actually about your process of telling the story. I mean, you are a magnificent storyteller.
Oh, thank you so much.
Magnificent storyteller. And there's actually, in fact, I'm gonna pull it up real quick. There was a line that was used in Dwight Gardner's review of Caste, where it says here, Wilkerson's book, here it is, Wilkerson's book is a work of synthesis. She borrows from all that has come before, and her book stands on many shoulders. Caste lands so firmly because the historian, the sociologist, and the reporter are not at war with the essayist and the critic inside of her. It's a brilliant, brilliant line. And not only is it true, I mean, there's such a beauty and an art in the way that this book is written, in the way that the stories are told, in the way that the understandings are received. How did you think about that in terms of, because there are multiple hats that have to be worn to be able to pull something like this together, and to do it in a way where people can understand the point, people can feel like the conclusions that they're coming to are conclusions that they came to naturally.
Yeah.
And then also feel a sense of stickiness, right? Feel a sense of, okay, but I also feel like there's something that I can do with this. How did you think about that in your process of pulling it together? And then how does that then shape the goal that you have for Caste?
I love what you said about how someone can come to their own conclusions, because I really do believe that that's an important part of what I seek to do. I would much rather show you than tell you. I would much rather, bring you on a journey, and at the end of the journey, you come to your own conclusions. I mean, I hope that you will come to a conclusion that I would like you to come to, but I don't want to be the one to do that. I would prefer that you do that. So the process means just going and going really deep rather than wide, which is one of the reasons why I don't bring in as many other countries as I otherwise might, because I wanted to go in deep to be able to draw upon what had been done before. But what it means is I was looking at almost any discipline, any discipline that touched on this topic, whether it was psychology, anthropology, sociology, history, of course, economics, philosophy. I had all of that I was trying to draw upon, because if it had Caste in it, I was trying to read it and trying to look at it, and speaking to many people along the way. Actually, people from the time that I completed The Warmth of the Suns. I mean, I've been, when you're on the road, as I know you have been, that you run and you meet so many people, and so I have heard so many stories along the way. All of those, stick with me, and all of those, I absorb those stories and I absorb those experiences, and you're always on the lookout, listening for what might be the spark for something. And so it's just being exposed to so much and then searching for so long and so deep. That's what led me to it. I mean, I was going with an open mind. I didn't go in with a sense of exactly what it was going to be. It's really, it's intimidating to start out with just an idea.
Yeah.
and I know exactly where it's going to lead you. You know, I land in the country. I landed in Berlin. I didn't know where it was going to be leading. I'm just going to as many places as I can, trying to meet with the people that I can, just following the road as it leads me. And there's a certain level of, you know, there's a lot of hard work involved, but there's also a level of serendipity, you know, of just being able to go with the flow and going with where it leads you, and ultimately collating all of that together in order to come up with the final version of it, which is always going to be story driven with me, because that's just what I do. That's just me.
Well, we are all better off because of what you do. You know, you will hardly ever find me without a, you know, without a book, just digging into things. But there are some that don't just stick with you, but that are true joys. This book is a true joy. It's a true joy because you end up smarter because of it. You end up more with a greater sense of urgency because of it, and it's a real sense of enlightenment. And I think about that truly in context where, you know, I remember someone once said about the book is that, you know, it's incredibly timely. The truth is that it's incredibly evergreen, and that's the point that you continue to try to make, is that we're talking about a topic that unfortunately is something that's evergreen and calcified. But if we're going to do something about it, we first must understand it. And I thank you for giving us the opportunity to understand this, to really better appreciate how the infrastructure of everything that we exist in is based on an infrastructure of this idea of caste. So we are incredibly grateful for the time and effort that you gave into something that is going to be a true contribution to our society and to our human evolution. So and honestly, I'm thankful for this conversation, because for me it's a deep and extreme honor to be.
Oh, I'm the one who's grateful. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be able to be in conversation with you. I've loved it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I encourage everybody to go get this book. Go get it immediately and tell people about it.
I second the motion. Let me just say, there were a few questions that came in that from viewers, and I'll just to add a little bit, because Wes covered most of what was asked in those, one way or the other, or Isabel went there. Isabel, there was talk of, you know, truth and reconciliation and that process, and the one person wrote. A good example, of course, being South Africa, but even Nelson Mandela noting, you know, the question of reparations. When does that enter into such a process?
Yes, well, on the matter of reparations, having written The Warmth of the Suns and documented what African Americans have experienced, just even in the portion of the 20th century that I was writing about, I believe that African Americans meet the standard, as do other groups that have been treated unjustly and experienced atrocities. Even that reparations are absolutely in line with what has happened with African Americans. I would also add, though, that I believe that reparations should come, though, with education. Really, I believe that reparations without education would mean that we could end up being in a similar situation in which people are not really clear on and truly understanding why reparations are necessary, why the disparities that we see exist. Why, for example, there's actually a study that shows that with the current circumstances, the current projections of the disparities in wealth between African Americans and their white counterparts, wealth meaning not being rich, wealth meaning having assets that can be tapped in times of emergency, for example. It shows that African Americans have 1/10 of the wealth of their white counterparts, or turning it around, that white Americans have, white households have often 10 times the wealth of their Black counterparts. Not Black people necessarily, all Black people, but in terms of their counterparts. So that you know, a well-to-do Black person has far less wealth than their white counterpart, and so those disparities are generational. That is not something that happened just overnight. That has to do with people having been enslaved for 12 generations, 12 generations. How many greats do you have to add to the word grandparent to begin to imagine how long that went on? Followed by 80 to 90 years of formal Jim Crow segregation, and such things as not being African Americans not being able to get mortgages, literally not able to get mortgages, because the government would not back mortgages for people buying homes where Black people live, which meant Black people could not get government-backed mortgages, while their white counterparts were able to get were able to get mortgages that were backed by the government as ways of building the American dream, which we all accept now as part of just what one does to build a family wealth. And so to be formally excluded from the most fundamental ways that a family might build wealth means that there's a long history, a long tradition, sadly, of African Americans not being able to being essentially excluded from the mainstream for so long. And that, as I said in the talk, that the idea of African Americans being brought into the mainstream is extremely, extremely new, very, very new. It's only going back to the 1960s. So what I'm saying is that in order for reparations to have the full meaning of repairing not just African Americans who generationally have lost so much, but repairing the country, repairing the schism, repairing the ruptures that have emerged because people don't know. People simply don't know. So I believe that education should go hand in hand in order for there to be a greater understanding of how we got here.
Good. Another question that a viewer asked, which many of the questions will be answered by reading the book, I will say. But this one could be a big answer, but we don't have time for that. But she does ask, because I don't think this was touched on, about the part of Nazi Germany in your story, the way you've written a bit, since that was, this may also answer one of the other questions, is how, because one of the other questions is kind of connected, is have there been societies where caste was dismantled? But you bring up Nazi Germany because it's a more finite period, and the word caste has not always been used with relative to what was done to the Jews there, Jewish people.
Yes, so there was 12 years of unimaginable horror that came to an end. Came to the end, and we know all how that came to end. So my interest with that is, as I said before, was sparked by Charlottesville because that brought together the disparate ways that countries deal with their history, and because the ralliers themselves made the connection, they themselves made the connection and felt a connection to the Nazis and a connection between the Confederacy and Nazi Germany. And so what my focus has been on is how has that country dealt with that era? What have they done in the intervening decades to begin the process of re-educating, educating, putting into context? What have they done with the things that with the Nazi locations, places that the Nazis were connected with? What have they done with that? How have they remembered their history? And it turns out that they have done many, 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 many things. And there have actually been several books that enlighten us on how they have managed this. And I think that they offer a window into understanding how we can begin to wrestle with this history. As we know, as a result of what happened with George Floyd and the protests thereafter, there have been cases where some of the statues have been torn down. These are by protests. But I would suggest that there should be a national reckoning, a national effort to understand, learn the history, and put into context what should happen with the memory to be honest, the painful legacy of the Civil War and of enslavement, which was the centerpiece of the Civil War, and of what happened after that, after Reconstruction. I mean, there needs to be a national reckoning, so that it should not fall to protesters to go in and tear these things down. It should be a concerted effort to figure out how do we remember? How do we remember, and how do we heal?
In the book, you succinctly put it too, that by all accounts, Erwin Rommel was a brilliant general, but there are no statues to him because he was part of that war. Yeah. There's one old group, there's a few questions actually that people could, if they go to the New York, Wes mentioned the New York Times, the review by Dwight Garner, in the, I think it's called the By the Book, there's a little column you filled out, and if you go to the New York Times and look up Isabel, and you'll get a few things, but if you look up By the Book, you'll see all these books she talks about, from fiction to the work being done by other African-American scholars right now and all that. But the question that came from our friend Vivian Phillips that's a little bit tied into that, but she specifically asked about Black women and who have been making more of these, doing this writing and articulating, and how is there a sense of how that's being received? Is there kind of a sense among the women collectively that you're part of the, what you're doing is there, because traditionally women have also gotten a lot of, had to deal with a lot of adverse response within different groups as well. So could you say a little bit about that? And Vivian's great.
Well, so I had the honor of doing By the Book, and there's a lot of books that you might want to recommend, and you have to narrow it down for basically for the questions that they have for you, and in the process of that, I mean, I had to think deeply about the books that had been so influential in the work that I do, and I really wanted to take this moment to speak about the work that had inspired or had influenced or even had been actually cited in the book that I've just finished, Caste, Origins of Our Discontents. And so there's so many books, obviously I can't go through all of them here, but a few that I would like to be sure to mention would be the work of Allison Davis and Burleigh Gardner. Deep South is a book that gets underappreciated. Thank you for having that. Yes. This is an extraordinary work, and the story behind the book is, that Deep South is an extraordinary work of scholarship, but it's accessible. I mean, these are scholars who went into deepest regions of Mississippi during the 1930s, during the depths of Jim Crow. It was a Black couple and a white couple. Both couples were anthropologists, extraordinarily well educated. They were graduates, had graduate degrees from Harvard. They were sent into Mississippi to document what they ultimately called a caste system in existence there. And in doing so, they had to live as the members of the caste to which they were assigned. And so it's just a fascinating story. Another one that I would mention would be Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington.
We didn't plan this.
Who did massive research, just incredible, magnificent work that documents the debt really owed to, by almost anyone alive today toward the enslaved people who were used by physicians, by the medical establishment for many of the discoveries that we now take for granted. I mean, just shocking investigation that she's done there, just massive amount of work, and just so helpful to understanding the history of how African Americans were used for medical experimentation. And then another book that I recommended was a cornerstone of anything about caste, and that is a book by Bimrao and Bedker, which is The Annihilation of Caste, in which he taught this. Bimrao, Dr. Ambedkar was the revered leader of the Dalits, formerly known as Untouchables. He was one of the founders of the Indian Constitution, and he devoted his entire life to the search for an advocacy for ending the unfair, completely unequal, tragedy of caste from his perspective. He was born a Dalit, born what was called an untouchable at the time, and he devoted his entire life to ending it. And this is his masterpiece toward a manifesto, you might say, of helping to break it down, to deconstruct it. And it's a document that is useful for anyone who wants to end inequalities anywhere in the world.
Great. Isabel writes about all of these books and others in Caste, and when we were talking beforehand, I said, were we in the hall, as we ideally would be, besides her two books. Of course, we don't want to leave The Warmth of Other Suns out of any conversation because it's there, but also Wes's books. But we would have had these other books that she just talked about, and because that's part of what Isabel and books like hers, but hers is a pretty singular book. You have them to read, and then you have more to do. And that Wes, of course, set that in motion too, saying to read. Did you want to say anything about Black women? And that was a part of that question. It was sort of led to the reading your other colleagues, female colleagues.
I would only say that that there's a recognition of the many challenges that we face, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, Caste, because there are many ways that caste intersects when it comes to. It's not just about race, which is the main signifier for for hierarchy in this country, but it's also gender, it's immigrant status, it's religion, it's all of those things. And so the more of those marginalized identities that one carries, the more challenges a person faces. I certainly have written about in this book the challenges that I face. The book is not about me. It's not. I don't even wish to speak about my own experiences. But to the degree that they were of help and some insight, I've included them. And I think that it's something that many women like myself can identify with and will see themselves in. But I think that it's something that everyone fits somewhere. Everyone has been assigned some place in the caste system. And so everyone is in this book, everyone.
So let me do a few forms of thanks, and then we'll let you each have last words. Again, I want to, as I did at the very beginning of this, want to thank the two organizations that really have helped. In fact, I got so excited wanting to tell the story of Isabel at the Northwest African American Museum. I didn't say enough about the museum itself because it has been a vital institution since it opened here in Seattle in 2007. And like other museums, it's not presently physically open, but you can visit it online at naamnw.org. Tasveer, which has also been part of this effort and occasion, is tasveer.org. It's a South Asian American arts group that if you go onto their website, you'll see something they are first and foremost known for is a South Asian Film Festival, which will be staged virtually soon, and a South Asian Literary Festival that will also be virtual this time around. And the third organization I want to talk about is mentioned because all these groups, when you go to their website, and actually tonight, proceeds from tonight are actually helping benefit the African American Museum in Tasveer. But the third organization we wouldn't have known about until Wes signed on, but for all the books he's been doing, he's also head of what's the Robin Hood Foundation, which does vital work in New York. And if you go to robinhood.org, you will see that good work, which I think Wes has like 2 lives that somehow fit into one, getting these books done, but also doing that work. And that is also worthy of financial support. So go to those websites. Lastly, to say for us at Elliott Bay, we also, I think my colleagues there, but also to let you know, we do have signed copies of Caste and as well as copies of some of these other books. Deep South, we're working on getting back in. We've had it, but already I think it'll be one of these books that Isabel refers to will be part of it. And thanks to our friend, to Janina of Bold the Tickets, who's helped make this possible, technically. And I think that's it, even though I see questions pouring in, but I think we do have to call this a night. I think it's later for some people on this than it is here in Seattle, where it's just a little after 6. Wes, do you have anything you would like to say here in the end? Or you gave kind of a nice benediction at the end of this, but anything else for you?
Well, I would just echo my thanks for including me in this conversation. Yeah. This is this has been an absolute joy, not just this conversation, but frankly to read this book. Yeah. And when we talk about things like the dominant class, when we talk about things like the lower caste, when we talk about things like the upper caste, it's important to understand the intentionality that went into the building of them. So it's important that we actually take the same intentionality of the dismantling of them. And so that's what I think this is such an amazing contribution that you've made to this and to our society. So thank you, Isabel.
Isabel, anything to say?
I would just say I look forward to the day when I can actually be in Seattle in reality. So I look forward.
we well, just very wholeheartedly wish that for that too. In fact, I got texted by my friend Shahina, who's with Tasveer, and she's like, she's marvelous, she's wonderful. And I said, yes. And she so wished to be here, and imagine the audience that we would have that way. But I know people here from all sorts of places, so it's a differently wonderful audience. The thing is, instead of standing up at the end and mingling and maybe getting books signed and books looked at and meeting new people, seeing old friends that all happen at those, and that kind of the community that comes out of that, and people they've never met before. We have to do that differently now, but that's part of, and we won't get to hear the applause, but we all get to go into our Friday nights. And for all of us, again, we thank you for being here. We wish you well. We wish you a good night, a good weekend. Hope we all stay safe. Hope we all get to see each other soon and enjoy the reading, because there's so much good reading to do. Thank you again, everybody. Thank you, especially Wes and especially Isabel. So take care. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.